Be'ezer Hashem, we start the third parak and the last parak, and that is in the Mishnah on the bottom of Daf Tes Omid Beis, Kohen Mashiach Shechotov Yachkach Ovar Memshichuso. So we're going to have two scenarios here with regard to a Kohen Mashiach. We're going to have a scenario in which he sinned and then he was removed from office before he brought his korban. And we're going to have another scenario where he was already removed from his position and then he sinned. And we're going to have a parallel two cases, two scenarios with regard to a nasi. So again, we're talking about the scenario where the chet was implemented at the time that the Kohen was in office and the nasi was in office. And the Mishnah paskins that Kohen Mashiach Mevipar, he brings his special korban, even though right now when he brings his korban, he is not functioning under the appointment of a Kohen Gadol. And a Nasi Mevi Seir, and the special korban of the Shogeg for a Nasi, which is a Seir instead of a Seira or a Kizba, is going to be brought because everything depends upon the moment that the transgression was violated. If at that moment the Kohen Moshiach was in office, then he has to bring his par. If at the moment that the Nasi violated his Avera B'Shogeg, he was a Nasi, then he has to bring a Seir, even though right now he's no longer functioning in the capacity as a Nasi. Now, what happens in the second scenario that we mentioned above, where the sin was transgressed after the Kohen Mashiach or the Nasi had already been removed from office? Mashiach sha'avar meshichuso. So first they removed the Kohen Mashiach from office, and then v'yachkach then he did a sin. So logically, you would certainly say that he's no longer a Kohen Gadol, and now when he transgresses the Avera, he's like a regular rank and file citizen who has to bring a korban chatas, a seira, or a kizba. After the Nasi was removed from office, he violated his sin. And again, logically, you would say for sure, in this case, he brings the classical seira of every common Jew. And yet, the Mishnah makes the following distinction, which surprises us. And the distinction is between Kohen Mashiach on the one hand and Nasi on the other hand. Kohen Mashiach may be par. So the Kohen Mashiach, even though at the time he violated his Avera B'Shogeg, he was not functioning as a Kohen Gadol. Nevertheless, he still has the status of a Kohen Gadol as far as bringing a par. And Hanasi, on the other hand, the Nasi, who was already removed from his appointment and then violated the transgression, then he will bring a Hedjot, a Kizba, or a Seira. So the Gemara says immediately, why did the Mishnah have to teach me both the Reisha and the Seifa? L'chora, I could learn the Reisha from a Kal V'chomer from the Seifa. Hashta yesh lomar. Now I would say the following, that in the case of Kohen Gadol, was saying that he has to bring his unique korban of a par, even if he violated the Avera after he was removed from office over Meshichu. So now we start today's Daf Tes, Daf Yud. The Aka Chota Mevi Par is Chota V'Acha Kach over Meshichu So Tzricha L'Meimar. Do I need the Reisha to teach me that if he violated this Avera when the Kohen Gadol was still in office, that he would certainly have to bring a par? If he has to bring a par, even if he violated the Avera after he was removed from office, how much more so would it be understood through this Kal V'chomer that if he violated the Avera while he was in office, for sure he has to bring a par? And the Gemara is going to answer with what I call symmetry, the old Aidi D'Tani kind of approach. Mishum de Ketani Gabi Nasi. It was necessary in the Mishnah to teach me with regard to Nasi that the Chia Ava Benisius Vakachota Kehejot Maisi, that once he's removed from office, the Nasi, if he goes ahead and then transgresses the Avera B'Shogeg after he already been removed from office, that he brings a classic korban chatos of a seira of a commoner, then adahachi Tani Gabi Mashiach, Chot V'Akach Over Mevi Par. So therefore, in the case of the Sefer, where in the case of the Mashiach, the Reisha, where the case of the Mashiach, the Kohen Mashiach who violated the Avera and then was removed for office, that he brings a par. So all this is just, to fill in the missing blanks here, but really there's no need to tell me that in the Reisha, with regard to Mashiach who sinned before he was removed from office, that he brings a par, that was understood, but it was only there to parallel the case of Nasi, and then to contrast the case of Nasi with the case of Kohen Gadol in the Sefer where he violated the Avera after he was removed from office. Minani Mili, how do we know that the Kohen Gadol retains his status as a Kohen Gadol even though he was removed from office? And the Pasuk says regarding the Kohen Mashiach, V'kriv al chatoso. And apparently these words are extra. It says in the Pasuk, Kohen Mashiach yechto lashmas ha'om, V'kriv al chatoso asher chato par ben bakar tomim Lashem lachatos. So what do we derive from these extra words? Vehikriv al chatos. That he has to bring this carbon, which is the carbon of the par, the unique carbon of the Kohen Mashiach, even though Misha'avar, he violated the Avera after he was removed from his position. Sheyachol, and could you have argued logically to the contrary without this pasuk? Halodinu, yeah, kal v'chomer. Uma nasi maybe b'shigas masa. So that a nasi, in regards to his chiyuv of a sa'ir, which is a special unique karvachatas, we have a gavaldige chiddush here that he brings that chatas even though there was no ruling, there was no decision that was mistaken, that was erroneous, but rather simply it was a classic shigiras maisa where he thought it was chelev and he thought it was shuvat and it turned out to be chelev. And yet, even though the Torah is much more machmir to impose that unique obligation on the nasi of a sair in Hilchos Gagos, nevertheless, Eino Mevi Chatos B'Shavar. But after we move him from office, and then he violated the Isur, he doesn't bring his carbon, and logically we would certainly derive the conclusion in Mashiach where the Torah was not so machmir, and a classic shkaga of Shigas Maisa would not be enough to generate that special unique carbon of a Kohen Mashiach, namely a par, is Mashiach she'ein maybe b'shigas Maisa elal heleim dovrim shigas Maisa. You need a second condition in order for the Kohen Gadol to be chayv a par. It's not enough that it was a shigas Maisa and he ate chalev inadvertently, but moreover, he had come to a mistaken, erroneous conclusion in the halacha, and he distorted the true halacha. That's called heleim davar. Is how much more so lokolshkein, certainly that if he violates his avera after he was already removed from his stature as a Kohen Gadol, for sure he falls into the classic category of all commoners who bring a carbon seira for a chatos. Talmud Lomer, and therefore I need the pasuk that justifies the pasuk v'hikriv al chatosim ulamid shebevi al chatosim misha'avar. Even though he violated the avera after he was removed from office, nevertheless he still retains the status of a Kohen Mashiach. And therefore he brings the power. Once you've already established that in the case of a Kohen Mashiach, even though he was removed from office, he still retains his obligation in the case of Shogeg to bring his unique carbon of a par, then let's derive a conclusion regarding a nasi in the case where he violated the transgression inadvertently of a chiyuv kares, that certainly he still retains his status as a nasi and is still obligated to bring his unique carbon of a nasi, namely a sa'ir. And the reason for this kal v'chomer is because the Torah was more machmir in the case of a Nasi than in the case of a Kohen Mashiach, as we saw earlier, because a Nasi will bring his special carbon of a soyer, even though there was no Helim Dover, simply because of Shigas Maisa. Ma Mashiach Sheinu Mevi b'Shigas Maisa, the Torah was more makil regarding that special par that is obligatory on the Kohen Gadol. And the Torah was very makil and says that the Shigas Maisa itself is not enough to generate that chiyuv on that par, because we need another condition, namely Helim Dover, and maybe Chatos Mishavar. And yet, even though the Torah was more lenient, nevertheless, the Torah says that he, the Kohen Gadol, retains his status as far as the par, even if he violated his transgression inadvertently after he was removed. Is Nasi Shemevi Chatos B'Shigas Maisa. The Torah was even more machmir regard to the special sa'ir of a Nasi, that he has to bring that sa'ir, even though there was no element of Helim Davar, it was purely Shigas Maisa. Eino din, how much more so Shemevi Chatos B'Shavar, that I should certainly, through this Kal V'chomer, derive the conclusion that even if the Nasi violated his Isur B'Shogeg after he was already removed, he should have to bring his special carbon of a Sa'ir. Talmud Lomar, for that I have a mute that says Asher Nasi Yechtok Shu Nasi in Shu Hedyot Lo. So this miyud is going to teach me that if he violated the Isur while he was a Nasir in practice, and his appointment as the Nasi was still binding, then he brings his special carbon of a sire, but not if he's been removed and then he violated his Avera. And this leads us to the Mishnah here on the top half of Daf Yud. What about a case where either the Kohen Gadol or the Nasi violated this Isur when they were still commoners, before they were appointed for their special appointedship? Is the Mishnah established? Everything depends upon the moment of the transaction of the violation, we'll call it, okay? The violation will freeze the special carbon, meaning if the violation was at the time where the Kohen or the Nasi were already in office, then you have the special karbanos, the par, and the soy. But if the Avera was performed before the appointment, then it was performed as a commoner, and that generates the chiyuv of a classic chatos of a kizbo se'ira. Now let's point out that there's time T1, time T2, and time T3. There's time T1 when the violation was violated, the transgression was done. Time T3 is when he brings his carbon. And then there's time T2 when he finds out about his transgression, which is called Yedias Achet. And that's Rabbi Shimon's unique approach here in contradistinction to the Tanakama, who says that Im nodu lehem ad shelo nismanu chayovim mishenismanu pturim. According to Rabbi Shimon, it's not enough to talk about the Avera per se as it was violated, but we have to add another condition, and that's Noda Elav. The idea is a precondition in the Machayev of the Karban. So therefore, when the Mishnah says that the Kohen Mashiach or the Nasi, who violated respectively their Shogeg, and they have to bring their respective unique Karbanos, and because it was before their appointment, they don't have to bring their special unique Karbanos. That's only because the idea came before the Avera. But if the idea came after the Avera, the idea came before the appointment. But if the idea came after the appointment, then that's a whole different story. Ezu Nasi Zeh Melech. Shenemar Mikol Mitzvahs Hashem Elokov. If a Nasi sins and transgresses one of all the commandments of the Torah of Hashem, then that are not to be done, and that's referring to a melech. She'ein al gabav el Hashem Elokov. That this nasi is described as someone who has on top of him, above him, as his sovereign dominion ruler, Hashem and nobody else. That is the king himself. How do we know all these dinim? How did we arrive at the Tan Rabbanan? We learned in a brayse, Im HaKohen HaMashiach Yechta. The Torah says that if the Kohen Mashiach violates some sort of an Isur B'Shogeg, and it's Yechta, he's Chayav because he was Chote as a Kohen, Prat L'Kodmos, to the exclusion of Averos that were performed, were implemented before he became a Kohen. So the Gemara says, I don't understand. You need a pasuk to tell me that if he violated this chiyuv shkaga before he was a melech, then his din is a commoner? I need a pasuk for that. Velo dinu, it's logical. And I'll derive it again from Nasi. Uma Nasi shemevi shigas maise. The Nasi has to bring his unique carbon of a soyer, even though there was no helim dover, there was only shigas maise. But Eino Mevi ala Kodmos. He doesn't have to bring his special unique carbon of a soyer for an Avera that he had performed before he was appointed as a Nasi. And the Gemara later on, as Rashi points out here, is going to derive that from a pasuk. Is Moshiach Shein Mevi El Helm Dover Shigas Maisa. The Torah was more makil with regard to Kohen Mashiach, that it's not enough to have condition number one, Shigas Mais, but you need condition number two, that's got to be Helen Tofar, and Eino Din, Shelo Yoval HaKodmos. And the truth of the matter is, I don't understand why B'chalal we need a pasuk for Kodmos. I guess there was a habmin to say that the Machayev of the carbon is the Shas Havos HaKarbon, and by that time he was already appointed. So the Gemara says, this is all a continuation of the price that we started with Tan Rabbanan, and the Gemara says that lo im amarta b'nasi, you can't prove anything from the nasi. Shekain ein mevi chatosa mishavar, the Kohen Gadol has one up it, lechumra, above the nasi, because the nasi, if he's removed from office and violates a chiyuv shkaga and a chatos, then his law is that of a commoner, and he doesn't bring that special carbon of a soyer. Tomar b'Moshiach shemevi chatos mishavar. The Torah is very machmir on this carbon par, the unique carbon of the Kohen Moshiach, that he has to bring that carbon even if he violates that Isur after he was removed from office. We might think that since in the case of a Kohen Gadol, he has to bring his special unique carbon of a par, even though he violated that Avera when he was removed from office. So we might jump now to the conclusion that maybe he has to bring that unique carbon of a par as a Kohen Gadol, even though he violated that Isur before he was appointed. Because we're going to compare now after he's appointed when he did the Avera to before he was appointed and we did the Avera. Talmud Lomer, therefore we need the passing HaMashiach Yechta Chata Kshu Mashiach Mevi Kshu Hedjot Eino Mevi. If the Chet was implemented before he was a Kohen Gadol, he was simply a Kohen Hedjot, a regular commoner, then he brings the general carbon that's chal for every commoner, namely a seira or a kizbah. We continue. V'tanya nami hachi gabi nasi ki agavna. We have a similar pasuk to exclude kodmos by nasi. Asher nasi yechta. The chait was after he was a nasi. Prat lekodmos, to exclude the case where he implemented the chait before he was a nasi. Valodinu. Again, I don't understand why do you need a pasuk to exclude kodmos in the case of a nasi. Halodinu. Uma Mashiach shemevi chatoso mishavar. The case of the Mashiach is more chomer. The Torah clamps down this chiyuv par, this special unique chiyuv carbon for a chatas for Mashiach or Mashiach, even though he was already removed from office, is Edo Mevi ala Kodmos, and yet we had a derivation that he doesn't bring a par for an affair that he performed before he was appointed. Is Nasi Shein Mevi Chatos Mishav? He doesn't have this unique chumrah that he continues to have an obligation to bring a par even after he was removed from his Nesius. Eino Din much more so Shalo Yavi ala Kodmos. And the Gemara answers, Malam Mashiach Shekain Eino Mevi V'Shkogas Maise. The Torah, on the other hand, was very makil with regard to the Kohen Mashiach, that even if he was a classic Shigagas Maise, he doesn't bring his special carbon par. It's only if you have the other condition of Helem Dovar, and therefore if the Torah was makil with regard to the Chiyuv par, the unique Chiyuv of a Kohen Mashiach, Tomer Benasi, and maybe B'Shigas Maise, but the Torah was more machmir in the case of Benasi, that even though we dropped the ball on that condition of Helem Dover, and all we have is Shigas Maise, yet nevertheless he has to bring his unique carbon of a Soyer. Holo maybe B'Shigas Maise, Yovi al Kodmus might think that if not for the pasuk, maybe the Torah would also be machmir and clamp down a chiyuv of that unique carbon of the nasi, namely the sire, even though he violated that isa before he was appointed as a nasi. Talmud lo b'sher nasi yechta shechata barehu nasi lo shechata v'denu hedge. So the sum total of everything that we've been studying is that when the Torah imposes a unique carbon, whether it be on a Kohen Gadol, whether it be on a Nasi, we always have to see to what extent is the Torah interested in that special carbon. How much power do we give, how much machayev power do we give to that carbon? And we're going to play around with two different halachas. On the one hand, the power of that carbon, that it generates a chiyuv even after he was removed and he violated the avera, and the power of the carbon that maybe even if he violated this avera before he was appointed, he might have a chiyuv of that unique carbon. Torah Rabbanu, we learned to the Brisa. Again, we're still talking about the special carbon chatas of the Kohen Gadol and the Nasi. Asher Nasi yechta yachol gzeira. Now, at this point in the sugya, we're getting a little bit of a digression into something more, what I call philosophical. Yachol Gzeira, the Brisa, is very careful about a change in the language of the Torah. All of a sudden it says, Asher Nasi Yechta, in the future tense. Does that mean that the Torah is already predicting? It's like a gzera min hashamayim that this nasi will sin. Talmud Lomar, for that, to exclude such a havamina, that there was already a predestined decree up in Shamayim that this nasi will sin, is Talmud Lomar, I need this pasuk, Kohen HaMashiach yechta, malahal l'sheyechta, afkan l'sheyechta. So just like in the case of Kohen Mashiach, again, the language of the psukim has to be analyzed. That's coming around the bend. But from the pasuk of Yechta, we're going to derive that in event, right? Because of the word im. Im means in event that the Kohen Mashiach sins. And by virtue of analogy of equation, we're going to say that in Nasi, we could also read it im Yechta, if he sins. Not that he will sin. Amar Mar, if we look at the Bryce, it says Yochel Gzera, Gzera Mehechi Teise. Mehechi Teise means, do we find a precedent somewhere in the Torah where the man's freedom of choice is going to be removed from him? Freedom of choice is one of the Yesodei Amunah. We believe that man is free of choice. Now you tell me there's a divine decree that'll sin? Amri, the Chacham said, there is such a thing. There seems to be a precedent to God foreseeing Israelites sinning. when it comes to nigei batim, the Torah already predicts that there will be nigei batim when we enter into Eretz Yisrael. They will experience negoim. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. So Rabbi Yehuda is assuming that the sins that bring about nigei batim will be, the Torah is guaranteeing, is decreeing they will be violated. However, Rabbi Shimon says no. What does it mean? Vinasati negat soras prat linigei onsin. The Torah is coming to exclude negoim that came not through some sort of a natural development of events, but through some sort of demonic, very evil kind of satanic influence. And in such a case, again, I'm not exactly sure how you prove that this is what happened, but if you can prove it, then there's no tumah of nigei bat. But lav Amar Rabbi Yehuda Besora. But let's go back to Rabbi Yehuda's shita. He's assuming that God is going to predict that there will be nigei batim. So maybe, just like we saw that God predicted that there definitely will be nigei batim, so too God predicted that the nasi will sin. So we need the word im, but again, this word im is technically in the parsha of Kohen Gadol, but by equation we derive nasi from Kohen Gadol. Are you telling me, based on this quote from a brisa, that Rabbi Shimon is committed to the position that if there's some sort of external cause, like a satanic cause from the outside, that brought about tzaras, then there's no tumah? But Tanya, what am I going to do with the following brisa? It says Adam kiyeh. Right, this is already a different kind of tzaras. This is tzaras haguf. Min adibur v'elech. What does this mean, min adibur v'elech? Adam kiyeh. It means that if, let's say, at the time of Har Sinai, the man already had the dermatological phenomenon of tzaras, he's not tameh. In other words, tzaras is something that has to come into being post Matan Torah. So don't raise a havamina that if at the time of Har Sinai of Matan Torah he was already afflicted with tzaras, that he's tameh. And we're going to exclude that from a special drush of Adam Kiyeh. And Kiyeh means min adibur v'elech. In fact, I don't understand why you need a pasuk for that. V'lo dinu. Timei bezav v'timei b'negoim. The Torah mentions that a zav who had, let's say, one riyah and then another riyah, either on the same day or on a different day, he's tamei b'tumah zav, which is the tumah chamura ma'od, he's metamei b'medrashu b'masa. And the Torah is metamei negoim. If the Torah was mekil in zav, which is a much more chomerdik tumah than tumas negoim, and yet the Torah says that if he was a zav before Matan Torah and he saw his re'ios, he's not tameh, is how much more so with the Torah was mekil vis-a-vis, if we compare it to zav, in the case of nigei batim, certainly I understand, or nigei aguf, I certainly understand that if these negoim and these dermatological phenomena were manifest before the Matan Torah, it would not be tameh. No. You know what? There's a chumrah in the goyim that doesn't apply to zav. So in a certain sense, negoim is adarabba more chomer than zav. Why? So if, let's say, we could figure out why he became a Zav. And this has to do with onus, which is something external, some external cause. He calls it here an outside factor, which I think means something like, the Satan or something, a shade. So he's not Tomei, but in the Goyim, he is Tomei. Now, how do we know that this represents the Shita of Rabbi Shimon? Just one second. Is Rabbi Shimon quoted here by name? Just one second. I don't see Rabbi Shimon's name here mentioned in the Bryce, but I'm going to assume that this no dissenting view is quoted in the Bryce. So the assumption is that Rabbi Shimon would also agree that Negoim are Mitamim Bionis. That's the Chumr of Negoim. And based on the Chumr of Negoim, that's Mitami Ba'ones, I would have a Havamina that even if the phenomenon of Tzoras manifests itself before Matan Torah, it would still be Tomei. And therefore we need a pasuk. Talmud Lomer Adam Kiyeh Min Adibur V'El. Rav Amar Prat L'Nigei Ruchos, Rav Papa Prat L'Nigei Kshofen. So here's the deal. Again, there's a lot of metaphysics here, but if, let's say, a man has a manifestation of Taras on his skin, but we can determine that somebody hit him, smacked him, burned him, or he fell, then he's Tomei. And the same halach applies to Nigei Bat. Whatever they did to the house, it caused this nega. Maybe it was flooded or something. However, if the tzaras was it was a result of ruchos, which are winds that are blown by a demon, and apparently it's possible to distinguish between two types of external stimuli that cause tzaras. When Reb Shimon said that the verse excludes tzaras afflictions caused by external stimuli, he meant only those that are afflicted by winds created by demons, or according to Rav Papa, powers of sorcery. However, tzaras afflictions caused by external stimuli are tameh, if they were inflicted, for example, by a person through a blow or a burn. We learned in a Bryce. Asher nasi yechta prat lechole. What's going on over here? It makes no sense. I mean, the nasi has a very bad, virus, and therefore he doesn't have to bring his special status of soyer. Mishum dehavile chole idchele min. What did they removed him from? He's got sinusitis, so they removed him from his office as a king. Omer of Avdimi Bar Chama. I always wondered about these names, where they came from. Avdimi, is that a biblical name? I don't know. Chama is a son. I don't know. Anyway, Prat Lidnasi Shenitztara. So now we're talking not about a choli in the classic sense. He's got a bad, sniffle or cough. but rather we're talking about a Nasi who was afflicted with what? With Saras. And therefore he has to go Chutz L'Machne, Chutz L'Sholosh Machnes. And therefore, at this point, he is removed from office and excluded as a Nasi. And therefore, the special Karban Chatas of a Soyer will no longer apply to him. Shenemar, Vaynagah Hashem. Okay, this is a story about Uzziah, was not a great tzaddik. He was stricken by Tzaras because he he brought the Ketores on the Mizbeach HaPnimi when he wasn't even a Kohen, and he was removed from his Nesius. Now this phrase, Bebeis HaChofshis, which literally translates as a house of freedom, is going to teach us that he was removed from office, because a Nasi is not a free person, believe it or not. On the contrary, he is totally under the control and dedicated to others. He has no freedom at all. But Yosam ben Amelech al-Bais, those who took over the kingship when Uzziah was removed from office because of his tzaras, he, Uzziah, the former Melech, experienced freedom. A king is considered an Eved. He's the servant of the people. So when it says in the Brisa, Asher Nosi Yechta Prat L'chola, it means Prat L'tzorah, it means that he does not bring his unique Karban Chatos of a Soyer because he was removed from office by virtue of the fact that he was afflicted with Tzaras. And now the Gemara tells the story. So they were on a boat together. Now Gamliel only took along for this very short sea voyage a pita, and he figures there's enough food in the pita that'll last me. I won't starve to death until I get to the next dock. But Rabbi Yeshua was smarter than him, because Rabbi Yeshua have a pita of a sulta. Rabbi Yeshua took along with him a bag of flour, reserves, that if they run out of bread, they can bake new bread with the flour. Shlim pita Rav Gamliel, apparently there was some trouble out at sea, and this voyage that was supposed to take a day or two ended up extending for a week or two. And Samach HaSulta Rav Yeshua, how did he save himself, Rabbi Gamliel, the king? He didn't have anything beyond that pita. He was starving. He got new, fresh bread from Rabbi Yeshua. Amalek. So Gamliel turns to Rabbi Yeshua and he says to him, are you such a prophet that you prophesied that we would be delayed for such a long time that I would need to bake new bread? Amalek. Now this has to do with astrology. Even though normally the sailors will tell you, they'll predict exactly what the conditions will be, but once in 70 years there's a certain star that rises up in heaven and it confuses the saponim, the sailors. The Amarti, and I said, Shema Yale v'Yasau Sonu. Maybe even though they're telling me it's a one-day voyage, maybe they're confused because of this this star that rises once in every 70 years. So I expected that maybe there'll be a possibility that we have to consider a longer trip. So I took along flour. Amalei, kol kach b'yodcha v'ta'ola b'sfina. You're such a great chacham. And yet, in order to apparently, Rabbi Gamliel knew that Rabbi Yeshua was traveling for business purposes. He says, "You have to go by boat. You know, this is for the for common people, not for people who are wise and sage like you are. Amalei, you know what? You are wondering, Rabbi Gamliel, about the fact that a sage would have to suffer poverty in such an extent that he's got to go for long trips on boats in order to bring in, food for his table. Don't be so, in wonder and shock about me. Tamal shnei talmidim sheyeshcha bayabosh Rabbi Lozer Chisma Rabbi Yochanan ben Gudgida sheyodim l'shar kamatipos bayam yesh bayam v'ein lem pas lecho v'lo beged lilbosh. These great sages, they can tell you exactly how many drops there are in the ocean. I don't know how they could know that, but anyway, and yet they don't have bread to eat, clothes to wear. Nasan Taitel Oshim Barosh. Rabbi Gamliel decided at that moment that he would take these two great scholars and put them at the head of the academy, and they would get a good salary. Kisha'ola, and when Rabbi Gamliel landed, Shalach envelope bo, they didn't want to come. They were too tznuim. They were very modest. They didn't think that they wanted to be the heads of the academy. Chazav v'shalach bu, but he sent a second group of people to bring him, and and then they finally agreed. Amalehem kimedum shatem atem srar ani nosen lachem. Why didn't you come the first time I called you? It must be that you knew that I'm offering you a position of authority, which you, in your humility, didn't want to accept.